Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Reflections on the Moment, Moving Forward Together, a conversation with our Black elected officials, co-sponsored by the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the Urban League, the Philadelphia Barristers Association, and the Brandeis Law Society. I am Arlene Fickler, and it is my honor to serve as the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council. The impetus for this town hall is, of course, the events that have roiled our country, stemming from the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. In response to those events, each of the organizations sponsoring tonight's discussion have recommitted themselves not only to combating racism and indeed all forms of bigotry, but also to working affirmatively in support of a United States that finally realizes the promise of the words taken from the Jewish Torah and emblazoned on the Liberty Bell, of a land that truly provides liberty to all of its inhabitants. That work has many aspects, including the introspection of understanding the history of racism and white supremacy in this country, and also advocating for fundamental changes in laws at the local, state, and national levels. While the organizations sponsoring tonight's program are all committed to nonpartisan programming and advocacy, we concluded that it was important to hear from our Black elected officials about the legislative initiatives that they have identified as priorities at this unique moment in time. Only if we understand the Black community's priorities can we Jews be better partners in advocating for change. I especially want to thank Brett Goldman and State Representative Joanna McClinton for helping to plan this important conversation and for assembling our distinguished panel. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel, comprised of elected officials representing Philadelphians at the national, state, and local levels. Congressman Dwight Evans has served in Congress since 2016, following a distinguished career in the State General Assembly. He has earned a reputation as a pragmatic leader who knows how to put policy above politics. Throughout his public service career, Congressman Evans has worked tirelessly to expand and broaden access to economic and educational opportunities for all Philadelphians. He currently serves on the Ways and Means Committee and as vice chair of the Small Business Committee. He is also an at-large member of the Executive Committee of the Congressional Black Caucus. State Senator Sharif Street represents the 3rd Senatorial District of Philadelphia in the General Assembly. An attorney by profession, Senator Street began his public career as a community activist, organizing a town watch group while in law school. He is currently a member of the American, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and National Bar Associations, as well as a member of the Philadelphia Barristers Association, for which he served as a board member in 2002. As a state senator, he is committed to improving access to health care, reforming our criminal justice system, creating quality jobs, funding our public schools, investing in science and technology, and fighting for the rights of all Pennsylvanians. State Representative Joanna McClinton has served in the General Assembly since 2015. She is both an attorney and a minister and is committed to bettering the lives of others. Representative McClinton has been acknowledged for her commitment to public service and enhancing the quality of life for residents in Philadelphia and Delaware counties by receiving several awards. In 2018, she became the first African-American woman to be elected as the House Democratic Caucus Chair. Councilwoman Sherelle Parker represents the 9th Councilmatic District. Prior to her election to Philadelphia City Council in November of 2015, Councilwoman Parker served for 10 years as the state representative for the 200th Legislative District in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, where she made history in September 2005 by becoming the youngest African-American woman ever elected. As a state representative, she earned a reputation for being one of the most effective, politically savvy, and proactive legislators in the region. Councilwoman Parker has been proactive in supporting economic development opportunities to benefit Philadelphians and all Pennsylvanians. Our distinguished moderator is Shari Williams, co-anchor of Action News at 5 and Action News at 10 on Philadelphia 17. Ms. Williams' work is rooted in strong reporting, both in studio and live from the scene. She earned her undergraduate degree in broadcasting communications from the University of Tennessee. She began her journalism career while still in college, producing feature stories on Tennessee volunteer athletes for Fox Sports Net South. In September of 2017, Ms. Williams was presented the University of Tennessee Alumni Promise Award. She has also worked as a reporter and anchor in Texas and Birmingham, Alabama. Ms. Williams is an active volunteer for many community groups and charities and is passionate about mentoring young girls. Her parents are truly her role models, but she also has a deep admiration for Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. One of her favorite quotes comes from Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Following the panel discussion, there will be an opportunity for questions. If you have a question, please write it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to all the members of our distinguished panel. We are excited to have this opportunity to hear about your priorities so that we may then partner with you in helping to achieve our shared goals. Ms. Williams, I turn it over to you.
Okay, Ms. Fickler, thank you so much. And thank you for those introductions of all of those who are participating on the panel tonight. It's my pleasure to serve as the moderator. I find this topic to be critical. I find it to be important and not only timely now, but it's been timely for a long time. And so I'm glad to see we're having this discussion. So to the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, and also quite frankly to Representative McClinton, who also reached out to me. Thank you so much for making me aware of this. This is something that matters to me personally, and of course, to 6ABC and to those I know who are tuning in on this call. It's evident by the amount of people who are listening. I'm going to get right into it for those who I know who are present and ready to start the discussion. So much, of course, that we have witnessed happen across this country. It has galvanized people. People who maybe weren't listening are now listening, and people who maybe were listening have a new tune to what they're paying attention to. And many people are asking at this point, how do we move from protest to policy? How do we move from the demonstrations to actually creating change? And I think speaking about how that can happen legislatively is really what people are really wanting to get to the meat of things. If I may, I'd like to start with Council Member Sherelle Parker to talk to us in regards to your view, Council Member Parker, in regards to what is happening on the city level, considering this is really where people are really in tune and in touch with their government on firsthand. I'd like to give you the floor first in regards to what's happening on the city level that those who are listening can know about, that the city is working on to create change in a positive way to adjust and address these current issues.
Shari, I want to start by saying a special thank you to you, the Jewish Federation, along with State Representative Joanna McClinton. She is what I like to call one of our chief connectors in the city of Philadelphia. So I want to thank you, Rep. McClinton, for helping to bring us all together. Let me just start by saying, Shari, that I'm a member of what I've coined the BTM generation. That is, I am a beneficiary of the civil rights movement. Didn't march, it was history. I watch clips like other people watch clips. But today, in 2020, we've watched a movement for social and economic justice move across the world. And it did it in a very organic and authentic manner. I think for us, in the city of Philadelphia. I think our local elected officials, I think they get it. I think we have all done what people don't expect a lot of elected officials to do, and that is to listen. And as a result of that, we have put forward a legislative agenda that is followed up by budget appropriations that signals our investment in those areas that people have demanded from all walks of life, but particularly the Black community. Let me just note this for the record, and I want to say this. Historically, when you think about Black people and our struggle for civil rights in this nation, we have used three primary vehicles. We have obviously used nonviolent social protests. We have also used the courts. In addition to that, we have used the ballot, and the ballot to elect people who will work to enact public policies that will help to improve the quality of life for all. So our response has been trifold. Number one, we've responded with multiple police reforms legislatively that we can enact. Number one, we introduced a bill, Council President Clark, requiring that not just all police officers, but all civil servants in the city of Philadelphia who work for the city of Philadelphia, they should be residents of the city of Philadelphia. In addition to that, Councilman Johnson, a chokehold so that we can address the misuse and abuse of power. They would be banned across the board. In addition to that, and this is not something that we often talk about, but it's that recruitment. The people policing Philadelphia should not just live in Philadelphia, but we want the demographic to look like Philadelphia. And so we've worked on multiple reforms. Obviously, dollars have been invested. You all know about the defund the police department, but I want to be very clear in that, because when people say defund, Shari, I say to myself, you need to define defund. If
That's
we're
right.
talking about redirecting resources to education, mental health, if that's what you mean about redirecting and reallocating funds, support it 1,000%. And that is the process that we've used in City Council. I want to close my sort of intro with this. There has always been a natural synergy between the Black community and the Jewish community in our battle and our fight for civil and equal rights. I think it is natural and it's sort of woven together generationally because we have a shared experience of being not just discriminated against, but basically told that you are less than human for no other reason than the vehicle that God chose to bring you into the world. And the Jewish community, because they were Jewish, the Black community simply because we were Black. I think that is why when we look back historically, I took a stroll through history, and when you can't talk about civil rights, right, without talking about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. You all remember that historic photo where he's marching with Dr. King along with Ralph Bunche and Abernathy. You can't talk about Abraham Joshua Heschel unless you talk about Rabbi Jacob Rothschild. Every activist rabbi that you will know will talk about standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Rothschild. And I will say for the record, I don't think it is a coincidence. I think our authentic collaboration, putting this together, ensuring that Black elected officials get an opportunity to share their perspectives and their stories, partnering strategically with organizations like the Barristers and the Urban League. I think our continued partnership will help us as we move forward and attempt to meet this moment, the challenges of this moment.
Thank you, Councilwoman Parker. I want to go to Senator Street. Because Senator Street, I think what the council member definitely is hitting on is for those who are listening in the Jewish community, they surely are trying to make sure they can be an ally. Will you talk a little bit about, for those who are trying to understand a little bit about the moment of what's happening now and what's needed to make that a little bit more clear in regards to how to come along as an ally, and along with, of course, I know the initiative that you're working on. You just worked, of course, on that piece of legislation about the police reforming, and also the ban on the chokehold in particular that you have coming up on some of the tactics that we see being used by our law enforcement.
Well, first I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here. And I want to thank all my friends in the Jewish community who organized this event, but say that a real ally for me would not have had me follow Councilwoman Parker, because I don't think anyone can appropriately
I had to pick somebody.
follow the Councilwoman because of the level of the comprehensive nature and thorough history she gave. But to speak specifically, look, I think to some specific legislative initiatives, I'm pleased to announce that we did move the chokehold bill that I introduced, Senate Bill 1205, out of the Senate Law and Justice Committee unanimously today. Expect that will pass the Senate later this week and go to the House. The information about passing a police database that would, and by the way, the chokehold legislation is more broadly requires use of force training and a use of force policy to be administered by every police department in the Commonwealth and to be monitored by MOPEC on an annual basis. We're also looking for there to be a database to keep track of misconduct. That legislation moved out of the Senate, introduced Senate Law and Justice Committee today, also unanimously, legislation introduced by Senator Costa. So I think we're doing some things legislatively, but I think, and I think the councilwoman alluded to it, there is a broader discussion that needs to take place in society for people to understand each other's experiences. I think that our friends in the Jewish community have historically been able to understand what it means to be in a situation where folks don't always understand what's going on with you. And the fact that that in order for you to get a caliber of justice that you need, there's going to be a little bit of a fight, and that people have to pay close attention to the details. There are some things that we cannot legislate away. Changing the culture so that if you're just driving through communities, you don't necessarily get stopped just for being a Black person and driving through certain communities. Those are cultural changes that have to happen, and they happen in a more subtle way. But what we find is that that discrimination is incremental, and that people, when we live in a society where people are accustomed to being able to treat some people in a manner where they're subjected to additional scrutiny, they're subjected to additional indignities. That happen if people are expected to endure more, then it becomes easier for other people to up the ante. And so things like being followed in stores and things there are elements to this that can't be legislated. And folks having an overall understanding that Black mothers have to worry about not just have to worry significantly about what's going to happen to their sons in so many different ways, sometimes daughters, but often it is sons, because Black men are often the subjects to some of this violence. And that's something that's sometimes difficult for other folks to understand. I think having a conversation about some of this stuff will help, and it will help in a significant way. So yes, we need help for and assistance with changing governmental policies, but we also can use some real help and partnership in just educating one another about changing some of the cultural norms that cause African Americans to be subject to both small indignities that make people more comfortable with escalating it to the larger ones that become televised and that shock the consciousness. We need, I would ask that people become sensitized to all of it, and as you talk about it and you become less tolerant of it, we will create a culture where people are more sensitive and less likely to, we're less likely to have these kinds of major things like, the guy who murdered George Floyd and who thought it was okay to put his knee on his neck and squeeze the life out of him, that officer, there's a context of society that allowed him to get to that point. If he had been checked at earlier stages in different places, maybe he doesn't feel comfortable engaging in that kind of behavior, maybe it doesn't escalate to that point. And so there are some things we can do as a society culturally to change things so that it's not just the most extreme things that we are reacting to, but we're reacting to some of the things that lead up to it. I had the privilege of, when I was at Wolf Block, serving on the board of, as one of the firm's representatives to the board of the Anti-Defamation League. And one of the things the Anti-Defamation League talked about was that there is a culture that before horrible acts occur, there's a culture that is created that allows them to occur. And that's why the Anti-Defamation League was so conscious about making sure people didn't speak about the Jewish people in a derogatory way and did not conduct themselves in what others may have seen as minor things. They said because it contributed to a culture where the dehumanization and the discrimination becomes acceptable. And those things we were taught as part of board training are what lead up to the ultimate acts of murder and violence. And so I think we in the African American community can learn some things. And I think we also have to start being less tolerant and of people doing the small indignities that create a culture where we can be dehumanized, which allows people to feel more comfortable ultimately committing acts of violence and murder against us.
I think one of the things I always stress is when you're trying to get someone to understand what your plight is, you surely know people get it when people will come alongside you who don't look like you. And that really is the big thing about having allies, that people who necessarily don't know exactly what that persecution, that particular thing is, but if they have enough care and empathy to speak up about it, that's what can help us change the culture. I want to go now to State Representative Joanna McClinton. And State Rep, I know in tandem, you are also looking into these reforms when it comes to policing. But in particular, that House Bill 1910, if you would walk us through that a little bit. One thing I read about that in the past 4 years, for a particular committee, the House Judiciary Committee, there hasn't been a single piece of legislation that came through there that was passed that had to do with police accountability, but we see now that is changing.
That's correct, Shari, and thank you so much for being our moderator this evening, and thank you to all of the organizations for sponsoring this important discussion. And House Bill 1910 is actually going to be voted on the floor of the House on Wednesday, and I look forward to that opportunity. And someone just sent a comment saying that implicit bias is kind of at the root of so much of the police brutality and other forms of hatred that we've seen and witnessed, especially in recent months. It's not new, but we've seen so much more of it now that people have social media and cell phones that videotape everything and they can go on live. And so this bill that we're going to be voting on, it will require that police officers across the state are trained on racial, ethnic, and economic diversity, implicit bias, recognizing and reporting child abuse, and have an annual training on the use of force. To be clear, it doesn't get to what we are hoping to get to in changing use of force and getting rid of that justification defense. Many times officers are even arrested and charged with shooting someone who was unarmed and who was running away and who wasn't a threat. But because the definition is so broad in Pennsylvania, there's a justification defense and they're always acquitted. So while this bill doesn't go that far, because of my colleagues' bravery 2 weeks ago, storming the House floor, having a protest, and in case anyone missed it, the Pennsylvania Legislative Black Caucus had a protest on the floor of the House 2 Mondays ago. And these bills, some of them we'd introduced a few years ago, but we could get no conversation and we could see no movement. So we're excited to finally see these bills getting ready to go over to Senator Street and then the Governor Wolf's desk so that they become a law, because the implicit bias training will help us all as we are wondering when police come to emergencies and respond, will they know, I'm not a threat automatically because I live at 60th Street. You don't have to be concerned about your safety when I need your help and I need your support and your assistance. So we are very excited that that's the first big lift in the Pennsylvania House right now. And we're looking for as many advocates as possible to just call your local legislator and let them know this is important to you too. as Councilmember Sherrell said, you know, we have been able to join alongside of each other for years, and it has helped bring about change. We can't do everything alone, and I pride myself on being an ally to your community. I say the root of my faith is certainly the same faith as yours. And in addition to that, when we look at all that's occurred, and we always are fighting together, white supremacy and that evil and the KKK, we have so much more work to do. So House Bill 1910 will be a great start in requiring training on implicit bias for police across the state.
Again, so many people are asking, you know, how can we help? And again, this is what this is all about for those who are in the Jewish community who are asking that question. And it can be as simple and as though impactful as what you just said, State Rep, and that is to call the leaders and let them know I stand with this, I support this as well, so they can keep a track of this is not just a small portion of the community that is responding and that is making it known that this isn't okay, that they can then see there is power in numbers, and there is no doubt about that. I want to see now if Congressman Evans, is he on the call? I didn't see if I saw him here. Congressman Evans, are you there? Did I get him? Okay, there you are. Thank you. All right, thank you, sir. Congressman, you know, we hear what's happening on the city level, and then we just spoke with our 2 state representatives. This too is your home. This is what you represent in DC. And so much, of course, we see comes out of Capitol Hill. So I really want to give you the floor here now in regards to the pressing pieces of legislation that you see that can be impactful and that are garnering, hopefully, support on both sides of the aisle.
I thank first Joanna for showing her leadership. I think this is extremely important, and I thank all the organizations. But before I talk about specifically the legislation from Washington, I'd like to say 4 basic things. The first thing we should clearly understand in all this issue is Black people are not monolithic. Black people are not monolithic. That is very, very important to understand. So approaches will obviously be somewhat different, we'll keep in mind. Secondly, 1968, the Kerner Report. 1968, I was in high school. 1968, report came out and said basically there's the difference in the Black community and the white community. And here we are in 2020. Here we are in 2020. If you just read that report, 1968. Last but not least, there's over 300 million Americans. Yet poverty, 144,000 people. 144,000 people. Same thing is talked about a Poor People's March. Sounds familiar? That's the same thing Dr. Martin Luther King talked about. You cannot ignore the anger that is out there. There is deep-seated anger that is out there. Now, you talk about, obviously, police aspect, but we live in a city which has 24% poverty. If you look at each one of these districts, maybe except to Sherrell's to a degree, if you look at Senator Street's district, North Philadelphia, you look at Joanne McClintock's, look at the level of poverty and correspond it with the question of violence that is occurring in those very same communities. So there's no way you can separate the aspect of violence and poverty and healthcare and health disparities. All those disparities, and they happen to be in the district I represent, the congressional district, because Joanne is in that district, Senator Street is in that district, Councilwoman Blackwell. So you look at the 3rd congressional district, you look at the question of poverty, you look at the disparities, and it's not an accident that the virus has affected vast majority African Americans. When you talk about first response, you talk about essential workers, in grocery store workers, in nursing. You look at those elements. Those elements are specific. If you look at 52nd Street, 58th Street, you look at how those neighborhoods look in 2020. You look at those neighborhoods look in 2020. So in Washington, one of 55 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. There's 55 members. The district I happen to represent, one of the original founders was Robert N.C. Nix, was one of the original founders in this district and was chairman of the Post Office Committee. The post office was extremely important to African Americans. That's how they moved to the middle class. They moved to the middle class based on post office. Those blue collar jobs that exist. A great book to read is by a sociologist named Julius T. Wilson called When Work Disappeared. You can correspond when the work disappeared, exactly what was happening in the African American community. So what we plan on doing, Karen Bass, who's the chairperson of the Congressional Black Caucus from California, we're going to pass a bill on Thursday, and we're going to pass it because there's 230 co-sponsors. All Democrats, no Republicans. All Democrats, no Republicans. And the fact of the matter is not like didn't want Republicans, just that no Republicans decided to see this problem the way we see it. So that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is the politics is so poisoned. The politics is poisoned, which makes it look like it's a problem with Joanne, Cherie Street, Sherelle Parker. It's not a Black problem, it's America's problem. And when you don't get people, so we're going to do things by ban the chokehold, which is similar to Cherie Street. We're going to talk about the National Data Center, which across the nation. We're going to talk about training. We're going to talk about money that's directed into communities that come up with different ideas. So I'm going to just say this in closing. These conversations are great, but we need to have these conversations with white people. We can't just have them among ourselves. They got to be conversations that whites also understand exactly what is happening, because the people we represent, and primarily all of us represent predominantly African American at various economic levels, they feel frustrated because when they look at their neighborhoods, they look at their communities, they are at a point where they don't see anybody solving the problem. So we will pass the bill, and the question will be, in the Senate, will Mitch McConnell, will Donald Trump, now will they do what they need to do? We're gonna pass, that bill's gonna be passed. There's no question, we're in the majority in the House, we will pass that bill. The question is, like with most things, will it come to a point that individuals begin to understand that we too are Americans? That's a fundamental question. I thank you.
Okay, Congressman, and yeah, you make a great point. We have to begin to make sure that people understand that Black folk in this country are not visitors. We too are American citizens. I want to go quickly around the so much back of what's happening in the Black community, and Congressman, you just touched on it, is the economics. So what is in place, and I want to go quickly on the topic so we can get to a couple of more, and I'm going to start with you, State Representative McClinton. What can we say is in place in regards to jobs and funding, and how can our Jewish partners help in any regard when it comes to economics, business, jobs? I want to get your thoughts, all of your thoughts on that. Representative McClinton?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Shari, and I will be quick. So some of the things that we have worked hard on is to ensure that we have partnerships with the large institutions in our community. In my legislative district, just one more mile and you get to the best world-class institutions. And I'm talking about Penn, I'm talking about Drexel, I'm talking about the University of the Sciences. These institutions are some of the larger employers in the whole state. Penn's the #1 employer in the city. And we want to make sure that our neighbors have a streamlined opportunity to get jobs there, but also to have training. And some of the training that we've been doing are through programs like the West Philadelphia Skills Initiative. And that program needs more dollars from corporate sponsors to be able to train more people. It targets folks who are in zip codes 19143, 3904, and a few others to train them so that they can get jobs at CHOP, at Children's Hospital, and many other institutions where it be more difficult. Also, we know we have the group Philadelphia Works, who they partner with the state office of the Work Ready. And we're trying to get jobs for children and teenagers in the summer. So if any of you have opportunities for internships, I know that all of our legislative staffs, even through working remotely, we get lots of requests. And in the House this summer, we can't give any internships to students. So if that's something that you could partner and help us with, we'd be very glad to funnel them your way and to be able to see people get in the space where they're able to become economically independent and thriving.
Yeah, we very well may have someone in the Jewish community who's listening who is a business owner or has access to get people, what I call, if you can hire and fire, then you've got power. So those of you who are listening, it's surely if that's something you can assist with, you can consider that. Councilwoman Parker, your thoughts in regards to how do we get the economics to flow on this thing when we know poverty is such a big hindrance for what's happening?
Sorry, I'm so happy that you mentioned that. You know, you heard me historically mention Rabbi Rothschild and Rabbi Heschel in my opening remarks. The great thing about it was Rabbi Heschel marched, Rabbi Rothschild didn't, right? So each of them had a lane. What I've been having very frank conversations with a lot of my friends, and I've said, you know, it's really interesting that a lot of people will shout, you know, we need to address the issue of police brutality. But when we talk about diversifying boards and commissions, when we talk about getting access to C-suites, when we talk about sort of opening up access to opportunity, equitable access to opportunity when it comes to the economy, there is not so much of a loud, unified voice. So whatever firm you work with, maybe you look around your firm and you say, diversity can add value. You know, how can we diversify our board? How can we diversify our newsroom? Look at what just occurred at the Philadelphia, Inquirer. And that is something that has been a major challenge for us, that when it comes to addressing the police reforms, you hear people's voices loud and clear, but we have to be just as tenacious and unified in diversifying access to equitable opportunities. And so that is jobs, that's the economy. Let me give you a quick example. I'm a graduate of Lincoln University. This is a little known historical fact that people don't talk about. Black people talk about Albert Einstein. We have a hospital in my district named after him. They know him at Princeton. Do people know that Albert Einstein came and taught the theory of relativity at Lincoln University? First historically Black degree granting institution of higher learning at Lincoln University. He proclaimed that racism was the white man's problem, and it was something that all of America was responsible for addressing. So here it was that he used his intellectual prowess, he used his international fame in the world of academia to share at a place where people traditionally would not have expected this Jewish scholar to come to this historically Black college. So what institutions can you partner with to share some of whatever your expertise is? That will be helpful to us.
I think one of the topics people have been talking about as we look into racial inequality and looking for justice, people say it's not just enough not to be racist, but we need to be anti-racist. And that is a bit of a call to action. Senator Street, for those who are listening and trying to understand what is the pain and the hurt, but now B, how can I be a part of that solution? Anything that you see in your day-to-day routine, in the way you legislate, in bringing in that economic portion and poverty, and also how that ties into how much of the pain and the fear, all of these things are really tied together.
Well, look, I think there are public policies people can support that would be helpful. And I think there are ways that people can be helpful in their own sort of walk through life. Supporting things like equal opportunity, equal funding in education. We spend multiple times more money educating children in Lower Merion, for instance, than we do children in Philadelphia. Level funding in education, greater investments in education. Education has been an equalizer. Supporting policies that eliminate redlining and implicit bias in lending. With banks, we looked at when the federal government chose to push out the PPP loans as a part of COVID through the banks. 95% of people of color who applied, who owned businesses, were denied. And that was because the banks pushed out that money as they do private capital. So access to capital is a challenge. And then for African Americans who are working in corporate settings, corporate mentorship, allowing people to, whether it be internships like Representative McClinton talked about, or access to the C-suite like Councilman Parker talked about. A lot of that, the success people have is because other people in those organizations help mentor them and open doors and opportunities by taking people under their wing. Part of my success as a lawyer, and I practiced law for 18 years before I went to the Senate, part of my success had to do, 16 years, had to do with the fact that there were people who mentored me. One of those people, some of you may know, when I was at Wolf Block for over a decade, when I got there, you can't be at a firm with hundreds of people and be successful and survive for a long time if nobody's showing you the ropes. Alan Kessler, who is Jewish, took some time and decided to take me under his wing and really brought me in like family and helped me navigate the world of sort of big corporate law. That doesn't, I don't make it 11 years if Alan doesn't take some interest in me. And all too often, people tend to take interest in people who look like them or remind them of them or come from their communities. In the African American community, where there aren't as many of us in the C-suite or partners at firms, we need folks from other communities to have some interest, to take some interest in aspiring young people, and so that we can then open doors for others. So I think we both need people to support public policy that creates economic opportunities. And then we need you in your individual lives to make a commitment to one or two people who your path happens to cross. And I can say in a personal way, Alan's taking an interest in me affected my legal career, and not only my legal career, but my ability to raise money was in many ways, because he took me to fundraisers that he was doing for other folks like Ed Rendell and allowed me to raise money in a way that was substantially different from the way my father had to do it. And the reality is I'm vice chairman of the Democratic Party in part because I became a deputy general counsel when Alan Kessler was active in the party and active in the DNC nationally. You need people to open doors. And so I think there are ways that people in the Jewish community recognizing that someone had to open doors for them can open doors for us as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Getting to the table. How can we get more access? How do we get more exposure? And if that is, Anastasia Gray made a comment. She said, we need to open our eyes and speak out when we see wrongdoing, jobs, and housing. Congressman Evans, I wanted to circle back to you and bring up in regards to symbols and any other topic you want to raise. We know, I definitely wanted to mention this.
My hero was Reverend Leon Sullivan. And Reverend Sullivan was appointed to General Motors board. By him being on that board, he was able to influence the policy of the aspect of procurement, jobs, supply. Just think, in 1968, first Black person ever appointed to the board of General Motors. Now, obviously, the world has changed from 1968, and we live in a different world. So the question is, who is on the boards? He affected not just domestic communities regarding African Americans. He affected South Africa. By him being on that board, as the per example, that model can be duplicated. If you look at who's on the board, you look at who has a lot to say about the policy. You look at how people get in the position that they're in. Reverend Sullivan has a book called Bill, Brother Bill. When individuals talking about burn, brother, burn, he was talking about Bill, Brother Bill. So my sense is, first, we need to understand the history. And the history is there for everybody. If you look at him as a role model, which I do, I watched how he built the OIC, how he built the owl market. What you see now as convenience stores, you watch him build. You watch that. So what I'm saying is, yes, you can deal, but you have to use the influence other than the public influence, the private sector influence. You got to use those relationships to build, to give the people to be entrepreneurs. You got to build more entrepreneurs. You got to build entrepreneurs. You got to build jobs. Because 9 times out of 10, people hire people they look like. Mm-hmm. Just look at the statistics.
Or
you only have to
look
look
at the statistics. People that we know, and we've been saying that more, all of us need to diversify those who we run with and who are in our groups. If you had a barbecue this weekend, would you be able to say you had someone in your best, could be said too, of our Jewish child, touch and feel and know a person who is of this person of color?
Well, but the point of it is, you know, when I first was hired, came out of work, it was a Black man at the Urban League who gave me that shot to move up within the Urban League. He's no longer around. So I'm sharing with you that one of the things that still is an issue, which we don't talk about, is those relationships individuals have. So the reason the PPP program coming out of the federal government was a failure come out initiative is because individuals didn't have the banking relationships. And why didn't they have the banking relationships? Why didn't they have those banking relationships? Okay, you go to any particular bank, that is generally done. Just like United Bank was formed by Emmett Chappell and others. Now, so the reality of it is, a lot of this is connected to relationships that people have. Unless you prepare to structurally change the relationships economically in terms of the corporations they have, where they located at, how they elevate people, you're never going to get to the point of transformative structural change.
Did you want to say anything, Congressman, in regards to the federal funding, the ban on the Confederate symbols? I know that's something else that you've got coming up.
I'm a co-sponsor with a congressman out of New York. He's the first Dominican American ever. He took the seat that Charlie Rangel used to have in Harlem. So yes, I introduced the bill, like first time I got in Washington, to get rid of these statues and that the federal government shouldn't be sanctioning them. Our bill's now getting the attention, which 2 years ago that I introduced this bill. And the point of I introduced the bill because these symbols has symbolized the wrong thing for many, many years. Many, many years, they said. So I'm happy that the young people, I give them full credit for being in the forefront, for being active, and for telling all of us in office enough is enough.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to go to Senator McClinton, and I wanted to briefly run through before we get to our Q&A section what's to be said about what's happening in the business community. We, of course, saw what took place when there was demonstration after demonstration in our city, and we know we have to be there for our small business owners, and I know you're very involved in what's happening on that front. Can you give us your thoughts and where we are in regards to Black-owned businesses and where we maybe are doing well or where we need to improve when it comes to how are we getting loans and funding, particularly to this group, and how critical that is to show young Black men and women that they can be entrepreneurs in their community?
Absolutely. A great question, Shari. One of the major challenges Black entrepreneurs have is not only getting access to the capital, but even having the support right around you to build your business. While I've never been out on my own, hanging up a shingle as a lawyer, as a little girl, my mother opened a business as a deli in 54th and Greenway, sold soul food and desserts. And she had the hardest time because she had to hire people, and she was proud to hire people from the neighborhood. But if we had more family support, some folks to just help her get it off the ground, it could have still perhaps been in existence today. However, as a result of the competition from other businesses selling food cheaper, she ended up closing in the 90s. And right now, with all of the destruction that we sorely witnessed about 3 Sundays ago, while many Black businesses were not all hurt, the business districts were hurt. And with business districts being hurt, people are saying, I don't want to go, to 60th Street or 52nd Street to Woodland Avenue. Everything's closed. I mean, there's so many places boarded up that say we're open, you can come in. And so we have to get over that as a city. Something we did in Harrisburg was fight really hard, specifically for a grant that's going to be rolling out July 1st for historically disadvantaged businesses. And that's not only for Black businesses, it also includes women-owned businesses, all sorts of minorities. So if anybody needs information for that, I'll drop it in the chat because it's important. This grant program will give you from $5,000 to $50,000, and it ranges and it will cover operational expenses. It's much different than the PPP loans. This is not for you to pay employees, even your rent for these months that are salons, because I've had this wonderful style for a long time. But I have an appointment coming up, so when you see me the next time, you might see a little twist out, little afro.
Go for it.
Because even our salons have been closed, and that has caused a big economic impact. So anybody that needs that information, I'll drop it in the chat. But any type of investments you'd like to do within our communities, we are lacking capital and investors. People are often going to downtown or other areas that may be quote unquote gentrified, but where I live, we are looking for investors to do development work because we want to be what it used to be, which is before the war on drugs. 60th Street, Southwest Philly, they were great places to go and shop and live. And so we are working hard to restore that.
I want to go to Councilwoman Parker and ask you, Council Member, in regards to, I know you sit on a number of the committees for the city. And of course, we've talked about a bit of the pain, the hurt, the history, the economics of this thing. But another piece, of course, is education and housing. I want to give you just a moment here, if I could, in regards to, can you, for those who have this issue with that phrase, defund the police. And let me say this as a journalist, we watched Camden disband its police department and become a model for this country. So it's not as if we don't know what it can be, it's just we haven't seen it a lot. And I know this phrase defund scares some people, but I think if we can explain to people that when we look at the amount of money given to our police department and what law enforcement should really be trained to respond to versus what all the things they're now being asked to respond to, some of this funding could be moved to housing and to education, where we do need to find a way to raise the level of all these other things that are, once again, it's all tied, some of it, to poverty. I know it's a loaded question. So if I quickly could get you to explain to people who are afraid of this phrase, defund the police, and how that could shift into housing and education.
Well, what we just did, Shari, is we just did it in the city of Philadelphia via our budget process. And you will see approximately 35 to almost $39 million taken out of the police department appropriation. And so that could be from the crossing guard. That could be a funding that they had or needed relative to mental health that you can redirect to community and behavioral health. So it's a lot of different line items that were appropriated to the police department, and people wanted to see those dollars reinvested in other areas. Important fact for Philadelphia. Yes, we're the largest, poorest big city in the nation. Lots of people forget that we also had one of the highest rates of home ownership in the city of Philadelphia. We've seen that number decline over the years. Now we're basically 50-50 with the number of homeowners and renters. So we just passed 5 bills, strongly promoted by freshman members of a city council, supported by all members of council, where we have helped people with their rent to ensure that there's some housing stability right now, particularly in the midst of a pandemic where someone could have to quarantine, in place. No one should be facing or risking losing, the place where they lay their head, because they don't have the money to pay rent because they lost their job to COVID. And so all of those investments and what we appropriated via the budget process for education, for housing, for community and economic development. Joanna McClinton, what you just said about neighborhood-based small businesses, so extremely important, because small businesses, they hire people who live in those neighborhoods. And when those businesses are not thriving, those neighborhoods are not safe, and the community at large is not as stable. Sherry, last thing I want to add to this, Senator Street, you mentioned Alan Kessler. You can't be what you don't see. My Jewish mother, Mary Hurdig, connected me to the Pennsylvania Women's Campaign Fund, connected me to Emily's List, Marion Tasco, her sister. They saw that Augusta Clark, they wrapped me up in their arms and said, Black girl from humble beginnings on the 1900 block of Penfield Street, we see something in you, and we're going to wrap our arms around you and mentor you. That is something that everyone can do, Sherry. Senator Street, thank you so very much for mentioning Alan Kessler and Congressman Leon Sullivan.
Yeah, it's great to know that we do have examples of people who have shown kindness, empathy, and courtesy, and quite frankly, who scooted over and brought us to the table. We've all needed that along the way. I want to bring this up to you, Senator Street. We do have someone who is inquiring about this as part of the comments I see, and it surely is one of the things I'm doing a lot of reporting on when it comes to police discipline, and when it comes to those who are on the force who should not be. And we know there are great men and women who serve every day, and we thank those who go about it with the right spirit and of what they've been called to serve and for duty. But for those who don't need to be there, when they get in the system and to go through discipline, I spoke with 2 former police commissioners for the city of Philadelphia who told me, I have the power to fire someone. The problem is the process that follows. So why is it sometimes when people are fired, the process that follows, people can get their jobs back who absolutely should not? What can we do on the state level that can be presented to really make it clear once police are disciplined, they shouldn't be able to backdoor through arbitration to be back on the force?
So look, I think there are two part components to this, and you touched on one of them. One of them is the arbitration system, and the second component is making sure we have a database to track who has been disciplined, and that that discipline follows them. I'm going to start with the database briefly, because it was critically important. Antoine Rose, who was a black young man shot in East Pittsburgh, was shot by an officer who on the first day on the job in East Pittsburgh shot him. But that officer had already been terminated from another police department for misconduct. But because there wasn't a statewide database that tracked his conduct, he was able to be hired in East Pittsburgh. And there was not a database that they would necessarily go to know that about his prior discipline. And so we can't have officers able to be successfully, and he was successfully fired and lost his job, was still able to be hired and still killed a Black man on the first day he was on the job as a police officer at that department, but had already been terminated. So we did advance legislation out of the Law and Justice Committee today. I'm a co-sponsor, prime sponsor, Senator Costa, to deal with that issue. And I bring it up because it was specifically a response to what happened with Antoine Rose, and it's a long time coming. The second issue is one that's sort of hot in Philadelphia, which is to deal with our arbitration system and what's wrong with it. Police have the right to binding arbitration in part because they cannot strike and they have to work, and a lot of folks have been suggesting we should focus on whether there should be an arbitration system. But I would suggest that another place we should look to focus is, why is it that arbitrators are supposed to be acting in a quasi-judicial manner, meaning that they are supposed to be rendering justice that is fair, balanced, and dispassionate in the same way we expect from a judge. I think we need to look at, and I've talked with people about looking at our arbitrator selection process. Who are these people that are being selected by arbitrators? Why do the arbitrators not honor the disciplinary decisions that are made out by by police chiefs? And what can we do to make sure that the pool of people from which we are selecting arbitrators will yield us a better caliber of justice? It doesn't matter what the system is we put in place if the people who are rendering those decisions are rendering them in a biased manner and are not recognizing the injustices that take place. So I think it is an important component of an arbitration system is there has to be a process for selecting the arbitrators so that they are rendering dispassionate justice based on the facts. And if that is done, I would submit that we wouldn't have these commissioners being routinely and almost chronically overridden by arbitrators. Right. Clearly, a variety of different police commissioners have suggested this is a challenge, and over a course of several different mayors. So I think that we have to look at the process by which arbitrators are selected, and then we have to look at a process by which we review those people who serve as arbitrators, so that those people who are rendering decisions that are inconsistent with justice are not allowed to continue to serve in that capacity. And that's something that is a state-driven process, and it's something I'm certainly talking with others about how we reform that process.
So at this point, there's nothing necessarily in motion. But the conversation is there.
Well, look, no, I mean, so we have to. So I wouldn't say there's nothing in motion. I say there isn't a specific bill I can point to. Okay. It is something that is one of the most talked about topics, and certainly. We can just sort of, as Congressman Evans pointed out, you can sort of write legislation and just introduce it. And there's some people that are, excited for us to do that. They say it gives us something to fight for. But there are some of these processes where we need to do a little bit of background, make sure we can get bills that can be agreed to, so we can actually pass them out of the General Assembly, get them to the governor's desk. And in doing that, get some real reform. I think this is an area that is ripe for some reform. And I would say on the first part, we did today move the database, which will track misconducts out of the Law and Justice Committee. Okay. And the same group of people are having conversations about how we look at this other process as well.
Okay, I surely wasn't trying to indicate nothing was happening. I was just trying to understand, was there anything in writing in that regard just yet? Congressman, before we move to the question portion here, is there anything on the radar coming out of DC that that maybe, as Senator Street was just mentioning, something that's garnering conversation, where you see the direction is moving, the needle is moving on reform? Or we are aware, of course, the president did do something in regards to reform that he announced, I believe, last week or so. But is there anything on the radar you want to bring us up to speed on before we move to the questions?
Qualified immunity.
Yes.
That safeguard should not be there. But I even like to go a little step further.
Okay.
I would say solvent immunity.
Mhm.
I think that mayors and people, remember, these people are hired.
Do you want to
by-
define that? You want to define that, Congressman?
Well, basically, it gives people right to exercise through the legal system. It gives people like qualified immunity. In other words, qualified immunity is a protection that police officers have.
Yeah.
So if you eliminate qualified immunity and you talk about solvent community, what you basically do is you open up for mayors and others. You hold people more accountable. Now, in my experience, I'm gonna tell you, two of the best people I know who ran the department in the city of Philadelphia was a gentleman by the name of Willie Williams. His son handles the police protection for the mayor. He was the first African-American police commissioner, and he came up through the police department. So leadership, the person who is in charge, remember, the person who's in charge has to also be accountable. So if you move qualified immunity, sovereign immunity, you remove those protections. And then you're basically put in a situation that you are going to pay a price for the behavior of your employee or your worker. You don't let these people think that they can just go around killing Black people without having to pay a price. So that gentleman, Willie Williams, I knew very well, and a gentleman named Mort Solomon, who was police commissioner right after Frank Rizzo. And he's established a policy about no use on the gun force. So unless you have a commissioner who steps out and says that this is not going to be acceptable behavior, you're going to be fired, you're going to go to jail. We're not going to accept you killing Black people. You need to have commissioners and mayors stand up and say, this is not an acceptable behavior. So Sharice can do what he does in Harrisburg and Joanne and Sherelle, but in running the department, you have to have from mayors to commissioners, they have to be held responsible. And we as the public have to hold them accountable. So if anybody gets killed, if anything happens to a citizen, a Black citizen, there needs to be a declaration by the mayor and the police commissioner that we ain't tolerating this, okay? This is not gonna happen in this city. So understand, if you look at the history of Philadelphia policing, you look at those commissioners, I know there was Chuck Ramsey, I don't know who the two people you was talking to, but there's some who have been some good commissioners, and none of this happened on their particular watch. And you ever ask why this didn't happen on their watch? Because I would argue that those people were in charge of the department and they wouldn't tolerate it. Now, the systematic aspect of it is what we are attempting to do in Washington, what Cerise Street is doing in Harrisburg, what Sherelle and Joanne are doing. Now we're trying to do it because you don't want it just based on, somebody who for an 8-year period. You want it to be across the board. So there's some.
Sure, you want it to be the new operating procedure, the real expectation. It needs to become the standard.
Exactly.
Yes, sir. Okay, I think we're going to move to the questions. And Ms. Robin, I actually can see them. I know you're going to help me, but I will read this first comment from Jocelyn Klein to you, Senator Street. She says, thank you for talking about the small indignities that are so important to address in order to impede a culture of hate and ignorance. This clearly identifies a way that all of us can actively address the sad state of affairs in this country right now. So that was one comment that just came in. Robin, are you okay if I proceed?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Was there a particular question that stood out to you? I do see them all here though.
Okay, no, please, you continue, Shari.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. Miss Laura Goldman is asking, can we outline the criminal justice agenda going forward? We only have 20 minutes, and we've got about 12 questions. So if there's someone who feels strongly about that, then please, and if I need to ask someone specifically, I will. But
Sherry, let me just mention to you from a city perspective. Number
Okay.
one, for the first time in the history of the city of Philadelphia, residents will get an opportunity to vote. The elimination of unconstitutional stop and frisk will be on the November ballot. So all voters of the city of Philadelphia will be able to raise their voices. The residency requirement, a bill that we just moved out of committee and will be coming up for a vote. The review process relative to contracts here in the city of Philadelphia, where we're saying before you renew the contract with the FOP, we should have a public review process so that Philadelphians can weigh in. In addition to that, Councilman Jones, that was Catherine Gilmore Richardson, Councilman Jones, Citizens Police Oversight Commission, and you heard me mention earlier that Councilman Kenyatta Johnson has introduced the chokehold ban. That's the legislation that has been introduced in the City Council of Philadelphia.
Okay, perfect. I think just to recap that, you said the stop and frisk will be coming up on the ballot. The recruitment portion, I believe that's about the police officers needing to be residents for the city of Philadelphia. I'm listening to you. And then the FOP review needs to be, their contract needs to be up for review through a process that will involve the citizens.
Right,
I think
before
all
you
of that
renew
actually.
let the public come up. That's right, Shari. That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
We have this next question here. Has there, and I think you touched on this a bit, Congressman, but I'm going to read the question. Has there been any thought to providing state law civil rights liability for police brutality, since the qualified immunity looks to be a bit off? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I had to talk to Cerise Street because he's right there. I mean, obviously, you know, we're doing it from a national perspective. Him and Joanne are there in the state. So to my knowledge, I don't know, and Joanne
or Senator Street?
They can tell you, yes.
So we don't have a bill right now to change the immunity, but what we are trying to do is dismantle Act 111, which is the arbitration. And that is always, you know, saying for firemen or police officers that whatever comes out of those arbitration, those decisions, they're binding. So we are trying to dismantle that first. We're actually meeting with organized labor because they have many concerns about us changing that. There's bills pending in Harrisburg, and I know there will be some coming out of city council locally as well.
To Senator Street here, someone who's listening says there are gross inequities in the level of educational resources in the suburban communities versus the city. So how can resources from suburban communities be allocated to the city? Is that possible? Would you support busing students from the city into the suburbs, or busing suburban students into the city to truly achieve this integration that we speak of?
Well, look, I don't know about, I don't know how much mass busing we could do. I don't have any problem with doing some busing, but I think what really has to happen is children need to be able to get a decent education in the communities in which they live. There's a fair funding formula that was adopted by the General Assembly. The problem is we identify what a fair funding formula is, but then we say only new money will be pushed in the fair funding formula. So right now, but the state by its own admonition pushes out probably 80 or 90% of the money through the old, what we call legacy formula, which is by our own definition unfair. So I support pushing out 100% of the state's resources through the fair funding formula, and that would go a long way in the leveling resources. Ultimately, I think the Commonwealth's obligation to provide a thorough and efficient education, as our Constitution reads, to every young person means we have to provide an equally funded education. There are a number of bills that seek to address this, but I think the most comprehensive and well thought out way to do it would be to push 100% of state funding through the fair funding formula, not just new funding. We shouldn't have a formula that we call fair, and then we push 90% out of the money through the legacy formula that we've acknowledged to be unfair. So look, I don't have a problem with busing. We could do busing, but I think to achieve it on the scale that we need to and to create a level funding everywhere, we really should just push the money through the fair funding formula.
Tell me, where are we in that process, Senator, in regards to this fair funding? Is that something that is being used, but just not used all the time? Is there a percent that's—
Yeah, so let me explain. So the Commonwealth commissioned a joint bipartisan, bicameral group to study what would be the fair way to push out funding resources. And there's a formula developed called the fair funding formula. But then because some people didn't want to lose their advantage in getting extra money, we decided we were only going to push the new money that was adopted after that, additional increases in funding through the fair funding formula. And all of the old money would go through what we're calling the legacy funding formula, i.e. the unfair funding formula. And right now, if you take 100% of the, if you took the state money and drew it into a pie, and you cut the pie into 10 slices, 9 slices go through the unfair formula, and 1 slice goes through the fair formula. If we have identified in a bipartisan, bicameral way that this is the fair way of funding the schools, we should put all the money through the fair funding formula, and then we'll be much closer to getting a fair result. Right now, even though we have admitted that that would be the fair thing to do, we don't do that because there are some school districts that are overfunded in terms of the Commonwealth giving them money, and what they've said is they wouldn't like it if we took away some of their money.
Sure. Right. Those who have it, understand, are trying to hold on to it. That's how this thing works. That's the power struggle we face. So my quick question, just quickly, is that something that could, if the people knew this, because quite frankly, I don't think people know this. If people knew this, is this something that could be pushed back to be rescinded and changed if people knew?
At any moment, if there are 26 senators and 102 members of the House and a governor's signature, we could change it. We could change it tomorrow.
Okay, I'm gonna look into that. Let's go to the questions again here. I believe someone was asking about the bill, Senator McClinton, that we discussed, which they just wanted the number again, but I know you put it in the chat box there, which of course was House Bill 1910, for those who were asking about the bill about the reforms. This next question, and I'll take this to you, Senator McClinton, who should investigate complaints against police officers in townships and boroughs across the state? And what if a resident believes an officer has acted inappropriately? I know that I covered the press conference that you and others held in regards to wanting to create some type of inspector general, an inspector to look into disciplinary concerns with law enforcement. Will you pick that up for us, Representative McClinton?
Absolutely. So as a former public defender, many times I defended people in Philly who were accused of assaulting police. But usually, and not all the time, usually they were the ones who had been assaulted. Perhaps there was a verbal altercation, or maybe they ran and they got beat up, and I would get police photos and see that my clients were victimized by several members of the police department. So we need outside agencies to have eyes on police departments. And one of the bills that we do have pending, it's not going to be voted on this week, but hopefully before the session ends, is to make police officers mandatory reporters, similar to how people who take care of our children, whether it's daycare or in school, anyone that interacts with children in an official capacity has to mandate the suspicion of child abuse. But police officers have this camaraderie and sometimes can even be intimidated by bad actors and not say, hey, you need to stop. We looked at those officers in the videotape of Mr. Floyd's death. No one said anything. No one did anything. And that's a culture that we have to counter with an outside agency. So we're asking the governor to appoint an inspector general, and he agreed to have a deputy. So it's not a whole office dedicated to it entirely, but he said there will be a deputy in Pennsylvania who's going to be able to investigate these independently of the union, independently of the district attorney's office locally, so that many people won't have to worry about the investigation either getting botched or diluted. Sometimes officers are arrested too quickly and they can't get a conviction. Other times they're just not fair investigations, like they were investigating regular, everyday you and I.
We have this other question here. Thank you, Senator McClinton, in regards to that. This next question, I will read it. Do you believe that potential backlash to so-called cancel culture could undermine consensus reform proposals? In other words, is cancel culture a problem? That question resonate with anyone? Cancel culture, I know, is a term that quite frankly people are using, but I'm not positive about how people want to define it. So let me see if they want to. Yes, okay. So whoever submitted that question in regards to cancel culture, if you would just give me a little bit more specific on how you're defining cancel culture, I'll see can we get that answered for you.
Would that be Donald Trump? I'm just asking. I'm asking the question because I mean, if you say cancel culture, I mean, you couldn't have somebody.
It's a phrase out there that's in regards to how I can't even get into it. It's simple, but it's deep. So I'm not even going to try and put words in that person's mouth. I'll wait for them to respond here. How can we create more programs such as Progress Plaza, which promoted business ownership support for Black Philadelphians? Anyone familiar with that?
Yes, that's Leon Sullivan. Leon Sullivan did. He had something called the 1036 program. And the 1036 program, Zion Baptist Church, he used the parishioners saved $10 a week over a 36 period. He then had the capital to go to a bank, and then he used the leverage of that capital. So Reverend Sullivan was the one that led the charge on that initiative. And I'm saying to you that that's the kind of policies that I believe when Joanne, who represents sort of Southwest Philadelphia, I mean, when you look at Baltimore, Woodland Avenue, those were very, very 60th Avenue. You're talking about communities that people got a lot of pride there. I know what she's talking about when she's talking about 60th Street.
Yeah.
And until maybe 60th Street, 58 Baltimore, 52nd the Market. If you look at those communities today, and you look at those there, they have good people trapped in bad situations. That's what you have. You got good people who are trapped in bad situations. And, until we, have that kind of real conversation about restructuring how you do something. I mean, at the national level, let me say this, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who's not a Democrat, he said, in order for us to deal with this problem, we had to go big and we had to go bold. Now, in the CARES Act, we did 2.2 trillion. In the HEROES Act, we did 3 trillion. So unless you're talking about that fundamental structural change, all the pressures on Joanne and Cherise and Sherelle, especially on the city perspective, there's such pent up expectations and their ability from a resource distribution standpoint to have it. So we got to have that kind of conversation, because when Cerise Street talk about schools, he's right, that basically somebody else don't want to give to somebody who may have a greater need.
There's a couple of questions that are in regards to our prison system, and that this is a privatization that really is, in essence, making money and also being a pipeline for our children. And how do we go about then reforming our prison system? Let me make sure there's the correct wording. Yeah, prison to pipeline. So many juveniles are doomed to bleak futures as the pockets of those running the private prison corporations are flattened. Is it the case, my city and state and congressman leaders, that there truly has to be a quota kept when it
Yeah.
comes to prisons?
So let me just speak from the city's perspective. We have closing a prison. Our prison population has decreased. We will actually, right now, we're trying to Google the actual number so we can put it in the chat box here now. But the concern about the prison pipeline, it's a valid one, and it's very much sharing what you described when I told you we hear people saying defund the police, and they talk about a reallocation of funding. When you get to the bottom of what people really mean when they say that, that's the same concern that we get when we talk about the prison pipeline here. And I am proud that in the city of Philadelphia, we've closed the prison. We've seen a significant reduction. As a matter of fact, we've received actually a grant. Philadelphia won a national grant and award for our criminal justice reform. Kudos to Commissioner Carney, our prison commissioner, who's done an outstanding job working with Larry Krasner, our district attorney, along with our administration and obviously our council. So we've done that on the city level, and we are continuing to move in that direction.
Yeah, I would just add. So, look, the prisons as an economic tool is something we have to get away from. It's real. When I first got to the Senate, there were hearings about the governor's plans to try and shut down a prison, and we had hundreds of people testify, and I had a number of colleagues who only talked about prisons as a place to employ people and as a methodology for economic stimulus in communities that they represent. And I still have colleagues that talk about prisons in that way. One of the things that I'm proud that Governor Wolf did was he held the line. We've put in place policies to reduce the prison population. And we've closed one prison and are in the process of closing a second prison at the state level. We've reduced the prison population by thousands. But we have to be deliberate in that response and that approach, and we got to understand that there are communities that are using prisons as essentially welfare, and they talk about corporate welfare, but there are ways that we take resources from urban, we take people and resources from the Southeast Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and urban areas, transfer it to areas where there is disinvestment in small town and Pennsylvania in order to create jobs. But we do that not only by taking resources, but there's a human cost to it because we're taking people out of the community. So there are a bunch of things we can do. Marijuana legalization. Yes, it will generate significant resources to the Commonwealth, with resources which we could invest in some of those communities, but also African Americans, Latinos are 5 to 6 times more likely to face criminal sanctions for marijuana, even though our usage levels are roughly the same. By legalizing marijuana, we would stop sending people to jail, and only folks that get locked up for it are people, Black and brown folks. We would stop sending people to jail for something that most people don't even treat as a crime.
Yeah, minor infraction
minor infractions, but those infractions reduce people's ability to get jobs, and we actually do incarcerate people. And even when we say we're going to decriminalize marijuana, we need to go to full legalization because of this. And I'll give you an example. In Indiana County, for instance, it was brought to, and in a number of rural counties, but I know it's been brought. There are people who will prosecute someone for drug paraphernalia because marijuana is in a Ziploc bag, and even though they'll say we're going to decriminalize the marijuana, they'll say possession of the Ziploc bag is a felony and give a person multiple years for possession of the Ziploc bag that contained the marijuana, even when they don't commit. And why do communities do that? Because they are financially incentivized to try and fill those prisons. So we have to be deliberate in looking at it. The other thing is probation and parole reform. Pennsylvania has more people under supervision than any other state in the union per capita, on a per capita basis. And what we need, and we violate people for technical violations. You can have 18 months left of sentence to do, get released on probation and parole, get caught in traffic, show up late to a probation or parole meeting and get sent back to jail for 2 years, which
Yes.
exceeds the maximum amount of your time. All these things contribute to our overblown prison population. So we have to be very specific in our approach, and we are. But the dependency of people economically on prisons is a real thing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and it's something that a lot of us are working. I will commend the governor for a very specific commitment to eliminate this, and the fact that when we have been able to save money, we've invested it both in what they call justice reinvestment, in programs to reduce recidivism. And the other thing that we've done is shift a lot of money to education. And finally, I love all the progress that the city's been made, but I will point out that the mayor that created the first mayor's reentry program was Mayor John Street. So I give a shout out.
Shout out to your family. Hey, if they're doing great things, please let us know, as you just did. Should I count that as your 1 minute in closing, Senator Street? Because we're about to close. What do you need 1 more minute, or what do you think?
I think I've taught, as my father would say, I was brief, even though it took a while.
Listen, if you would, I know people would love to get more information about your bill, which I did read, about the adult use of cannabis and moving to decriminalize marijuana. If that's something we can put in the chat box, the cannabis, your info, I'm sure people would like to know about that. So here we are in closing now, 60 seconds. And guys, I know what a minute is. I work in television. Congressman, I'm going to give the floor to you first, sir.
I want to thank all of the groups and thank Joanne and her leadership. That is something that's most important. That's something that's lacking. And I really thank the group. I mean, because the conversation is well done. Need to have some tougher conversation about the challenge of it. Please don't let, just because a bill passed, it may be in Harrisburg or City Hall or Washington, all of a sudden don't think the conversation is not needed. I would argue the conversation is even needed more. I see my buddy universal background check on weapons. Too many guns on the street. So too many weapons on the street. You got all these guns on the street, and then you have the conflict, and then, you can talk about black on black crime, the problems, and who's getting killed. So I would encourage you, we have that in there. So I just encourage people, don't let bills just pass. And last thing, there's an election 4 months from now. Pay attention to this process. Whoever you for, get your friends out there. This is a do or die. Thank
you, Congressman. Councilwoman, Ms. Parker.
Also, I want to just thank all of the sponsoring organizations. Just want to remind everyone that the struggles of the Black community, along with the Jewish community, we've always found a way to collaborate, and we always have found a way to lean on each other's struggles, and we found strength. The organizations that have come together today, we need you. And not just here in a moment, but we need long-term institutional relationships in any way that we possibly can. So we have to keep moving. Representative McClinton, thank you for being a connector. If someone was to say, Sherelle, what can I do? You're a teacher. I want to leave with an assignment. The assignment is to do what Roxanne Jones said, former state senator, in your own time, in your own space, and with God's grace, make a difference any way you can in your lane. We all can't do the same thing, but wherever you are, and using whatever vehicle you can, whether that's work, that's community, social and human services, advocating for a bill, just do your best in your lane. Thank you.
You're right about it. Wherever we can put our hands, let's put our hands to work. And Senator Street, I see that you've put those information in the Dropbox. Thank you for that, sir. And if you will, Senator, State Representative Joanna McClinton, everyone giving you all the praise, and I understand why, of helping make this happen tonight. Please, if you'll close us out with your remarks.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Shari. We know how busy your schedule is. We've appreciated your time and facilitating such an important discussion in our community. And to all of the stakeholders and organizers, thank you. And to everyone who called in, thank you. For many years, as a young lady, even younger than now, I always felt targeted, singled out, and by myself. And then when I was 18 years old, I was supposed to be going to Israel, and I didn't make it until last year, but I went to Auschwitz. And at Auschwitz, I got to see firsthand the outcome of other people being targeted, singled out, and being treated in a very horrific manner. And as a result, I've had a connection to your community since that moment. That was in 2001. And in 2020, we continue to remain together so that we can move forward together. Every single one of us has a sphere of influence. And whichever you can use your sphere to fight with us, let us fight this fight together, and let us not stop fighting. That's right, Congressman, I heard you. Not with just the bill getting passed and the bill being signed by the governor or even in DC, but let's keep fighting until there's the finish. And the finish is us all seeing our humanity. I wore my love pin tonight, not just for Philly, but for the fact that we are shared human beings. And in this day and age, as long as we've been occupying this earth, unfortunately, some don't realize that. And it's escaping them. And it is our responsibility collectively to make sure that we can walk and live in peace and love. Thank you.
And it's been my pleasure to be the moderator tonight, to hear all of these viewpoints, what's happening, what needs to happen, and how we're going to do it together. Thank you so much, Representative McClinton, for inviting me. Also, of course, to the Jewish Federation for also bringing me in on this. And I'm going to turn it over now to Ms. Shira Goodman, of course, the new director of the ADL in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Shari. Thank you so much for moderating. It's been terrific. I want to thank the partners, and I'll close with a word of Torah, if that's okay. Thank you to the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, and especially your staff, Robin Schatz and Batya Glazer, for putting this together. I want to thank American Jewish Committee and Marsha Bronstein, of course, the ADL and our Black Jewish Alliance, which was really excited about this program. And we're doing a program on allyship tomorrow, the Barristers, the Louis Brandeis Society, and the Urban League. Thank you, of course, Congressman Evans, Senator Street, Representative McClinton, and Councilwoman Parker. So in our Torah, we have a basic teaching, love thy neighbor as thyself. Hillel famously said, that is all of Torah and the rest is commentary, go learn it. What you have taught us tonight is all the ways we can love our neighbor as ourselves, how we can use our economic power, how we can use our advocacy power, how we can use our voting power, how we can be mentors, and how we can be partners. This is just a beginning for us. Nobody should think that this work is over, but you've given us of your time and your talent and your treasure. We're so grateful. Our community wants to be allies, as you so beautifully talked about, Councilwoman Parker and State Rep McClinton. We want that to continue. Those memories of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel, we want to create new memories today in 2020. You know, that was in 1968, and we all remember that, and we look at those pictures, but we need to be creating new memories right now. So thank you for starting us on that journey. And I hope that we'll all get back together, and I hope you all have a good night. It's still Monday, so a lot of time to do that work this week. It sounds like bills are coming up in the Senate and the House and Congress. And stay safe. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Good night.